No one could tame the Mafia boss Heart of Stone until two little girls, the servants' daughters, did the unthinkable. Harrison Blackwood wasn't merely dangerous. He was darkness on the move, sealed inside a black three-piece suit and leather gloves. At the age of 37, his icy blue eyes could make even the hardest men in the underworld lower their heads. People called him the Heart of Stone, not because he was cold, but because he had no heart. For private doctors were dismissed in 2 months, not because they were incompetent, but because Harrison couldn't stand anyone telling him what he had to do. "Get out of here." Harrison didn't shout. His voice was cold as a blade carving into bone, more terrifying than a roar. "I'm not paying $1,000 an hour to hear you tell me I need rest. Get out of my house before I change my mind about letting you leave in one piece." Dr. Cole snatched up his bag, walked quickly, but didn't dare run. Running in front of Harrison Blackwood was a sign of fear, and fear was the very thing that amused a predator. Jasper, Harrison's right hand, stood as still as a stone statue by the door. He learned how to recognize moments like this. It meant someone was about to lose their job, lose their freedom, or lose their life. But the instant the door closed, Harrison gripped the edge of the oak desk so hard his knuckles went white. A crushing headache detonated behind his eye sockets, as if someone were drilling straight into his skull. The room spun. His vision dimmed at the edges. He nearly fell, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself to stay upright. Terror squeezed his chest until it felt hard to breathe. But Harrison's pride was a fortress he'd built over 20 years in the underworld. He would never admit weakness, never admit fear, never admit that he was slowly dying. Meanwhile, down in the basement, two tiny twin girls were folding each pristine white towel one by one. Zoe and Ruby were only 6 years old, their brown curls tied into identical ponytails, dressed in simple gray dresses with white aprons. They were the smallest living beings in this enormous mansion, existing like ghosts no one was allowed to see. Their mother, Rosalie, was a maid paying a debt in place of her dead husband. 8 months ago, when Daniel Turner took a bullet through the head for failing to repay $4 million, Harrison gave Rosalie a choice. Work like a slave to pay the debt, or her 2 daughters would be sold. Rosalie chose hell. "Mom says the master fired another doctor," Zoe whispered as heavy footsteps sounded overhead. Ruby nodded, her green eyes wide. "Sister, he's very sick." "I can feel it." "I can see it, too," Zoe said softly, her voice trembling. "There's something very black, very bad growing inside his head. It's eating him from the inside." The 2 children didn't understand why, but they had always been able to sense illness in other people. And this time, what they sensed was more frightening than anything they had ever felt before. That fear didn't stay in the dark basement. It seemed to seep up through the floorboards like icy water, chilling Rosalie Turner to the bone as she scrubbed the grand foyer 3 floors above. Her fingers were raw, the skin around her nails cracked and bleeding from months of exposure to harsh chemical cleaners without gloves. The debt collector had laughed when she asked for rubber gloves during her first week, telling her that gloves cost money and she didn't have a cent to her name. The front door slammed shut, echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous house, signaling the doctor's hasty retreat. Rosalie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every slam, every shout, every heavy footstep brought her back to that night 8 months ago when her husband Daniel begged for his life on their living room carpet. She shook the memory away, dipping her rag into the bucket of freezing gray water. There was no time for trauma. If the marble wasn't gleaming by the time Harrison stepped out of his study, there would be consequences. And consequences in the Blackwood house usually involved pain. "Mommy, we finished the towels." A small whisper drifted from the shadows of the service corridor. Rosalie spun around, panic seizing her throat. Zoe and Ruby stood there, holding hands, their large green eyes glowing in the dim light. "What are you doing up here?" Rosalie hissed, scrambling to her feet and rushing toward them, her wet dress clinging to her exhausted frame. "I told you to stay in the basement." If he sees you, if Jasper sees you." She didn't finish the sentence because the threat was too terrible to voice. Harrison Blackwood tolerated her presence because she was useful, a machine that cleaned and cooked and suffered in silence. But children were noise. Children were mess. And Harrison had made it clear on the first day that if her daughters made a single sound, he would sell them to recoup the interest on Daniel's debt. Rosalie fell to her knees and pulled them into a fierce, trembling hug, checking the hallway for cameras. "You have to be invisible," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "Please, my loves. You have to be ghosts." "But he's hurting, Mom," Ruby whispered, pointing a tiny finger toward the ceiling. "The bad black thing is squeezing his brain. He's going to fall." Rosalie grabbed Ruby's hand, silencing her. "Stop it. Don't talk about him. Don't look at him. His sickness is none of our business." But even as she said it, Rosalie felt a chill crawl down her spine. If Harrison died, her nightmare wouldn't end. It would only change shape. The debt of $4 million wouldn't vanish with his death. It would be transferred to the estate, or worse, auctioned off to the highest bidder in the underworld. And the highest bidder would likely be Blake Morrison, a man whose cruelty made Harrison look like a saint. Morrison didn't just run numbers and protection, he ran trafficking rings. If the debt fell to him, Rosalie knew exactly where her beautiful, gifted daughters would end up. She wasn't just working to pay off a debt she could never clear. She was working to keep the monster alive because the monsters waiting outside the gate were far hungrier. A heavy crash from the second floor shattered the silence. It sounded like a body hitting the wall, followed by the shattering of glass. Rosalie gasped, her survival instinct warring with her curiosity. "Back to the basement," she ordered, pushing the girls toward the service stairs. "Go. Now. Lock the door from the inside and don't open it until I knock 3 times." Zoe and Ruby hesitated, their eyes filled with a strange, sorrowful knowing, but they obeyed. As their small footsteps faded, Rosalie grabbed her bucket and rag, preparing to flee to the kitchen. But before she could move, the heavy double doors at the top of the grand staircase burst open. Harrison Blackwood emerged, swaying like a drunkard. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, soaked in sweat, and his face was a mask of gray agony. He took a step, stumbled, and grabbed the railing to keep from pitching forward down the stairs. Rosalie shrank into the shadow of a large potted fern, praying to be invisible. She had never seen him like this. Harrison was always perfect, a statue of ice and iron. Now he looked human, broken. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure suffering, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "Make it stop," he muttered, his voice slurred. "Just make it stop." He took another step, his foot catching on the edge of the carpet. He pitched forward. Rosalie moved before she thought. She dropped her rag and sprinted up the first 3 steps, catching him just as his knees buckled. The weight of him nearly crushed her. He was heavy, solid muscle and dead weight. "Mr. Blackwood," she gasped, struggling to hold him upright. His body was burning up, heat radiating through his shirt like a furnace. Harrison blinked, his vision swimming in a haze of red and black static. He felt small hands on his arms, smelled the scent of cheap soap and old fear. He tried to focus, but the face swimming before him was a blur. "Who?" He rasped, trying to shove her away, but his strength was gone. "Get off." "It's Rosalie, sir," she whispered, terrified he would strike her. "You're going to fall. Let me help you to the chair." She guided him down to the velvet bench on the landing, her heart hammering against her ribs. If he thought she was attacking him, he would kill her. Jasper was downstairs checking the perimeter. They were alone. Harrison slumped onto the bench, his head hanging low, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, the headache receded just enough for him to see clearly. He looked at the woman kneeling before him. Her uniform was wet, her hands red and bleeding, her face pale with terror. She looked like a frightened rabbit in the jaws of a wolf. "Did you see?" Harrison asked, his voice dangerous and low. "Did you see me fall?" Rosalie shook her head violently. "No, sir. I didn't see anything. I was just cleaning. I caught the vase before it fell." She lied, desperate to protect his pride. He stared at her, his blue eyes drilling into her soul, searching for pity. If he found pity, he would destroy her. He hated pity more than he hated pain. But Rosalie's eyes held only fear and a strange, resigned determination. "Get out of my sight," Harrison whispered, closing his eyes as another wave of pain crashed into his skull. "If you tell anyone, if you tell Jasper." "I won't," Rosalie said, backing away slowly. "I didn't see anything." She turned and ran, her bare feet making no sound on the marble. She didn't stop until she reached the basement door, locking it behind her with trembling hands. She slid down the cold wood, hugging her knees to her chest. Upstairs, the most powerful man in Chicago was dying. And down here, in the dark, Rosalie Turner prayed for his survival, not for his sake, but for the two little girls sleeping on a mattress of old towels who were the only light left in her world. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate was a sea of black tuxedos and blood-red gowns, a Shark Tank disguised as a charity gala. Rosalie Turner moved through the crowd with a silver tray of champagne, her head bowed low, making herself as invisible as the air conditioning. Every face she passed was a reminder of the night her husband died, men who dealt in death while sipping vintage wine. She gripped the tray until her knuckles turned white, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, not for herself, but for the kitchen pantry. Behind that narrow wooden door, hidden behind stacks of flour and canned tomatoes, Zoe and Ruby were huddled in the dark. She had told them it was a game of hide and seek, but the terror in their eyes said they knew better. If a single guard opened that door, if a single child cried out, her life was over. Harrison Blackwood stood at the head of the room, a king presiding over his court, but beneath the impeccable suit, the king was crumbling. He had injected a lethal dose of painkillers just to stand upright, his vision blurring at the edges like a photograph left in the rain. Jasper stood 6 inches behind him, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket, his eyes scanning the room for threats. But the real threat wasn't an assassin with a gun. It was the ticking time bomb inside Harrison's skull. He smiled at a senator, shook hands with a judge, and pretended he wasn't counting the seconds until he could collapse. He was a master of deception, but there was one man in the room who saw through the mask. Blake Morrison cut through the crowd like a knife through silk, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. At 38, he was the youngest Don on the East Coast, a predator who smelled weakness the way a shark smells blood in the water. He stopped in front of Harrison, his gray eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "Harrison," Blake said, his voice smooth and loud enough to turn heads. "You look tired. I heard a rumor you fired your 4th doctor this month. Maybe it is time to retire before you fall down." Harrison stiffened, his jaw clenching. "I will retire when I am dead, Blake. Until then, get out of my way." Blake laughed, a low, mocking sound, and reached out to pat Harrison's shoulder. It looked like a friendly gesture, but it was a test. Harrison flinched, a microscopic tremor running through his right hand, the hand holding his whiskey glass. Blake saw it. His smile widened, cruel and victorious. "Tick-tock, Harrison," he whispered. "Tick-tock." Harrison turned away, ignoring the cold sweat sliding down his spine, and walked toward the stage to give the keynote toast. He needed to assert dominance, to prove he was still the Lion of Chicago. He stepped up to the microphone, the spotlight blinding him, turning the audience into a faceless ocean of darkness. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice booming through the speakers. "We built the city on order. We built it on strength." The crowd fell silent, captivated by his power. But then it happened. A sound like a gunshot cracked inside his head. The pain wasn't a headache, it was an execution. Harrison gasped, the microphone slipping from his hand. The room tilted violently to the left. He tried to grab the podium, but his fingers were numb. He collapsed. The sound of his body hitting the floor was heavier than silence. For 1 second, the room was frozen. Then chaos detonated. Screams rang out. Bodyguards drew weapons. Rosalie dropped her tray, the crash of breaking crystal lost in the roar of panic. She stood paralyzed near the kitchen doors, watching the man who held her life in his hands convulse on the stage. Jasper sprinted forward, sliding on his knees to catch Harrison's head. "Boss, boss," he screamed, slapping Harrison's cheek. But Harrison's eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. Foam bubbled at the corner of his mouth. The on-site medic, a nervous man named Dr. Evans, pushed through the crowd and fell to his knees, pressing 2 fingers to Harrison's neck. He checked the pupils, then looked up at Jasper, his face drained of all color. "It is a rupture," the doctor shouted over the noise. "Massive hemorrhage. He is not breathing. He is gone." The words rippled through the room like a shockwave. The king was dead, or he would be in seconds. The guests began to back away, murmuring, calculating their new allegiances. In the center of the room, standing calm amidst the storm, Blake Morrison took a sip of his drink. He didn't look surprised. He looked satisfied. He looked at the dying man on the stage, then he looked around the room, his eyes claiming everything Harrison had built. Rosalie saw that look. She knew what it meant. If Harrison died right now, the debt transferred to Blake. And Blake didn't want money. He wanted flesh. She looked at the kitchen door where her daughters were hiding. She looked at the dying man. And in that split second, terror gave way to a desperate, insane resolve. Rosalie didn't think, she reacted. The survival instinct that had kept her alive for 8 months of hell took over, overriding the paralyzing fear of the gunmen and the screaming crowd. She turned and kicked open the kitchen door, startling the 2 small figures huddled in the darkness among the sacks of flour. "Come with me," she ordered, her voice cracking with terror, her hands shaking as she reached for them. Zoe and Ruby looked up, their eyes wide and wet, sensing the chaos vibrating through the walls. "Mommy, the bad men are out there," Ruby whispered, shrinking back against a shelf. "I know," Rosalie said, grabbing their hands and pulling them to their feet with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "But the man who owns us is dying. And if he dies, the man who wants to sell you takes his place." It was a cruel truth to tell 6-year-olds, but there was no time for lies. She dragged them into the service hallway, their small feet stumbling to keep up with her desperate pace. They burst into the ballroom, 3 ghosts in gray rags interrupting a funeral for a king. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, not out of respect, but out of sheer shock at the intrusion. Who was this maid? Why was she dragging children toward the body? Jasper looked up from Harrison's chest, his eyes red with panic and rage, his mind already mourning the loss of his boss. He saw movement in his peripheral vision. He saw a threat approaching the fallen dawn. He drew his weapon in a blur of motion, the barrel leveling straight at Rosalie's chest before she was 10 feet away. "Back away," Jasper roared, his finger tightening on the trigger, his discipline fraying under the stress. "Get back or I put you down." The guests screamed and scrambled back, expecting blood to splatter the expensive parquet floor. Rosalie didn't stop. She threw herself onto her knees, skidding across the polished wood, pulling the girls down behind the shield of her body. She looked up into the black bore of the gun, staring death in the face without blinking. "Shoot me if you want," she screamed, her voice tearing through the silence. "He is already dead. You said it yourself. Let them try. What do you have to lose, Jasper? What do you have to lose?" Jasper hesitated, his combat training warring with his desperation. The gun wavered just an inch. In that split second of doubt, Zoe and Ruby moved. They didn't look at the gun, they looked at the man dying on the floor. They crawled out from behind their mother, ignoring her sharp gasp, and knelt on either side of Harrison Blackwood's head. He was gray now, his skin waxy and cold, his breath a rattling gasp that signaled the end. Zoe placed her small, calloused hands on his sweat-drenched temples. Ruby placed hers on his chest, right over the heart that people said didn't exist. "It's so loud," Zoe whispered, closing her eyes tight, her face twisting in concentration. "The black noise is screaming." "Push it out," Ruby answered, her voice surprisingly steady for a child, her palms pressing down hard. "Push it away like mom's headaches." The room went deathly silent. 50 of the most dangerous men in America held their breath, watching 2 servant children touch the untouchable. Blake Morrison stepped forward, a sneer curling his lip, ready to end the farce. "Get those brats away from him," he spat. "This is embarrassing." Then the air shifted. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a sudden drop in pressure that popped ears and raised the hair on arms. A wave of heat rolled off Harrison's body, shimmering like asphalt on a hot summer day, distorting the light around the twins' hands. The violent thrashing stopped instantly. Harrison's back arched, not in pain, but as if he were taking a massive, desperate breath after drowning. The gray pallor of death vanished, replaced by a flush of life that started at his neck and raced up to his cheeks. The foam at his mouth stopped bubbling. The terrible rattling in his chest smoothed into a deep, rhythmic rhythm. Zoe and Ruby gasped in unison, their heads snapping back as if they had been struck, sweat instantly drenching their hairlines. They pulled their hands away and slumped against Rosalie, exhausted and trembling. Harrison Blackwood opened his eyes. They weren't glassy. They weren't dead. They were ice blue, sharp, and terrifyingly alive. He sat up, the movement fluid and strong, and looked around the silent room. His gaze landed on the trembling woman and the 2 small girls huddled on the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Harrison spoke. "Who?" he rasped, his voice rough but steady, "brought me back." Blake Morrison dropped his glass. It shattered, but no one looked at it. They were too busy looking at the miracle that had justified death itself. The private clinic smelled of antiseptic and expensive silence. Harrison sat on the edge of the bed, the paper gown crinkling under his grip, while Dr. Cole stared at the MRI films on the light box like he was looking at a ghost. There was no tumor. The mass the size of a golf ball that had been eating Harrison's frontal lobe for 6 months was gone. Not shrunk, not dormant, but gone. "It's impossible," Dr. Cole whispered, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake up from a dream. "The tissue, it hasn't just healed. It's regenerated. Like it was never damaged in the first place." Harrison didn't look at the scans. He looked at his hands. They were steady. For the first time in a year, there was no tremor, no numbness in his fingertips. The constant, drilling pain behind his eyes had been replaced by a strange, humming silence. He felt lighter, cleaner, as if his blood had been drained and replaced with sunlight. He remembered the feeling of small hands on his face. He remembered the heat. And he remembered the fear in the eyes of the woman who had thrown herself in front of a gun to save him. "Where are they?" Harrison asked, his voice cutting through the doctor's muttering like a knife. Jasper stepped out of the shadows in the corner, looking exhausted and wary, his suit rumpled from the chaos of the gala. He knew what was coming. "We have them in a secure room at the mansion, boss." The woman and the 2 girls. Harrison stood up, ignoring the doctor's weak protest to remain seated. He walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, his reflection staring back at him, a man who should be dead but was terrifyingly alive. "Who are they, Jasper?" "I saw the mother. She wore a maid's uniform, but I don't know her face." That was the sin of his world. Servants were furniture, invisible until they broke something or stole something. But she hadn't been invisible last night. She had been a lioness defending her cubs. And those children, they had touched him with a power that terrified him more than death. "Tell me their names," Harrison ordered, turning to face his right hand. "And don't lie to me." Jasper pulled a tablet from his jacket, his fingers swiping across the screen with reluctant slowness. "Her name is Rosalie Turner," Jasper said, his voice low and heavy. She's been working in the house for 8 months. The name hung in the air like smoke. Turner. Harrison felt a cold spike in his gut, a different kind of sickness than the tumor. Daniel Turner, Harrison said, the name tasting like ash. The gambler. Jasper nodded, not meeting his eyes. The man you executed in his living room 8 months ago for a $2 million debt. Rosalie is his widow. The twins. Zoe and Ruby are his daughters. The silence that followed was heavier than the grave. Harrison gripped the windowsill, the glass groaning under the pressure. He remembered that night vividly. He remembered the desperate man begging on his knees. He remembered the sound of the gunshot. He remembered pulling the trigger without a second thought because business was business. The realization hit Harrison with the force of a physical blow. He had killed their father. He had enslaved their mother. He had forced those children to live in his basement like rats, threatened to sell them if the debt wasn't paid. And when he lay dying on a ballroom floor, when he was helpless and vulnerable, they didn't let him die. They didn't take the revenge they deserved. They saved him. Why? Harrison whispered, the words scraping his throat. Why would they save me? Jasper didn't have an answer. No one in their world would have done it. In their world, you took an eye for an eye. But those children had given him a life for a death. Harrison looked at his hands again, the hands that had pulled the trigger on Daniel Turner. They felt stained, not with blood, but with a debt he could never repay. Get the car, Harrison ordered, grabbing his shirt from the chair, his movements sharp and desperate. Take me home. I need to see them. He wasn't the king of Chicago anymore. He was a man standing in the wreckage of his own cruelty, and for the first time in 20 years, he was afraid to look someone in the eye. Harrison sat behind the massive oak desk in his study, the very place where he had signed death warrants and ordered executions for 20 years. But today, the paper in front of him wasn't a hit order. It was a bank transfer receipt for $10 million. He looked up as the heavy door creaked open and Rosalie walked in, her hands still red from the lye she used to scrub the foyer. She didn't bow this time, and she didn't look at the floor. She looked straight at him with eyes that held 8 months of silent screaming. "Sit down," Harrison said, his voice lacking its usual bite, sounding almost hollow in the large room. Rosalie remained standing, her posture rigid as a soldier facing a firing squad. "I prefer to stand," she answered, her voice flat and dead. Harrison slid the folder across the mahogany surface. "The debt is gone. For $1 million erased. The interest erased. And in that account is $10 million. Take your children. Go anywhere in the world. Just leave this house today." He thought he was being generous. He thought he was being a savior. He expected tears of gratitude, or at least relief. Rosalie looked at the folder as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the wood. She didn't reach for it. She laughed, a dry, cracking sound that felt like sandpaper against Harrison's nerves. "You think you can buy it back?" she asked, stepping closer to the desk, her fear burning away in the heat of her anger. "You think a number on a screen washes the blood off your hands?" Harrison stood up, his instinct to dominate flaring up, but he shoved it down. "It is enough money to live like a queen for 3 lifetimes, Rosalie. It is freedom." Freedom, she spat the word like poison. "My husband begged for his life on this very rug. You shot him while my children were sleeping in the next room. And then you made me scrub his blood out of the fibers so you wouldn't ruin your shoes." Harrison flinched. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had forgotten the cleaning. He had forgotten that he made the widow clean the mess of her husband's murder. "I am trying to make it right," he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I am trying to give you a life." "You aren't giving me anything," Rosalie said, leaning over the desk, her eyes blazing with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You are paying me to go away so you don't have to look at the reminders of what you are. You are a monster, Harrison, and no amount of money will ever turn you into a man." Harrison sank back into his chair, stunned into silence. No one had ever spoken to him like this. No one had ever dared to strip away the myth of the Mafia Don and show him the butcher underneath. He looked at his hands, the hands that Zoe and Ruby had touched with such gentleness, and for the first time, he saw them through Rosalie's eyes. They were filthy. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself with the laws of his world, but the library door slammed open. Jasper burst into the room, his chest heaving, a tablet clutched in his sweating hand. He didn't knock. He didn't apologize. He looked from Harrison to Rosalie with wild, terrified eyes. "Boss, we have a problem," Jasper choked out, throwing the tablet onto the desk between them. Intercepted chatter from the Morrison crew. It is everywhere. The dark web, the street corners, the encrypted channels. Harrison looked down at the screen. It was a photo of Zoe and Ruby, taken from a long-distance lens through the kitchen window. Below it was a price tag, $20 million. Alive. "Blake knows," Jasper said, his voice trembling. "He knows what they did in the ballroom. He is calling them the Miracle Twins. He has put a bounty on their heads. Not to kill them, to capture them." Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. Blake Morrison didn't want to traffic them for labor. He wanted to traffic them for their gift. He would lock them in a cage and sell their healing to the highest bidder until they withered and died. "They can't leave," Harrison said, the realization settling over him like a lead blanket. He looked at Rosalie, who was staring at the photo of her daughters, her anger replaced by a mother's absolute terror. "If you step one foot outside these gates," Harrison continued, his voice hardening into the command of a general at war, "Blake will snatch them before you reach the end of the driveway." Rosalie looked up at him, tears spilling over her lashes. "You said I could go. You promised." "That was 5 minutes ago," Harrison growled, slamming his hand down on the desk, not in anger, but in desperation. "The world has changed. You wanted freedom, Rosalie? Freedom is a death sentence. You are staying here." Rosalie backed away, shaking her head. "No. You're trapping us again. You're keeping us as slaves." "No," Harrison shouted, moving around the desk to grab her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "I am not keeping you as slaves. I am keeping you alive. You hate me? Fine. Hate me. But stay behind my walls, because out there is a monster worse than me." Rosalie looked into his icy blue eyes and saw the truth. He wasn't trying to own them anymore. He was terrified for them. The east wing of the Blackwood mansion was a fortress within a fortress, accessible only by a biometric elevator that required Harrison's thumbprint. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a world of cream carpets, silk drapes, and windows made of bulletproof glass thick enough to stop a sniper round. Rosalie stepped out, holding Zoe and Ruby's hands so tight her knuckles were white. She looked around the opulent penthouse suite, seeing not luxury, but bars made of gold. "This is where you will stay," Harrison said, standing by the elevator control panel, his posture rigid. "The windows do not open. The doors lock from the outside at night. There are panic buttons in every room. If you press one, armed guards will be here in 30 seconds." He sounded like a warden reciting the rules of a supermax prison. Rosalie walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the garden where she had once been allowed to walk for 10 minutes a day. "It is a beautiful cage," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "But it is still a cage, Harrison." Harrison didn't answer. He couldn't. He knew she was right, but the alternative was a shallow grave for 2 6-year-olds. He turned and left, the elevator doors sealing him out of their world. But he couldn't seal out the noise. For 20 years, the Blackwood mansion had been a tomb of silence, a place where servants held their breath and footsteps were swallowed by expensive rugs. Now it was alive. The twins, released from the damp darkness of the basement, didn't understand the concept of a death threat. They only saw a playground. They ran down the long hallways, their laughter bouncing off the vaulted ceilings like church bells. Zoe pressed her face against the glass of a display case holding a Ming vase worth $500,000, leaving a smudge of grease on the pristine surface. Ruby jumped on the velvet sofas, testing the springs. Harrison stood in the doorway of his office, watching the chaos with a mixture of horror and paralysis. His instinct was to roar, to demand order, to terrify them into submission. But every time he opened his mouth, he remembered the feeling of their hands on his dying body. He remembered the heat, and he closed his mouth, retreating into the shadows, a king deposed in his own castle. That night, Harrison sought refuge in the one place the noise hadn't reached: the library. It was a cavernous room of 2 floors, filled with leather-bound books and the smell of old paper and scotch. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid, his hand shaking slightly, not from the tumor, but from the stress of having a conscience. He sat in his leather armchair near the fireplace, staring into the flames, trying to burn away the image of Daniel Turner's face. He didn't hear the door open. He didn't hear the small footsteps on the Persian rug. He only realized he wasn't alone when a small hand placed a book on his knee. Harrison jumped, nearly spilling his drink. Ruby stood there, wearing a pair of oversized silk pajamas Jasper had bought in a panic. She looked tiny against the towering bookshelves, but her green eyes were ancient. "You're hiding," Ruby said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Harrison set his glass down, his heart hammering a strange, uneven rhythm. "I am working, Ruby. Go back to your mother." Ruby didn't move. She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle with a missing piece. "You aren't working," she whispered, stepping closer until her knee touched his leg. "You are hurting, but not in your head anymore." Harrison stiffened. He felt exposed, peeled open like a fruit. "I am fine," he lied, his voice rough. "The sickness is gone. You took it away." "We took the black thing away," Ruby corrected, her voice serious. "But the blue thing is still there. It is heavy. It sits on your chest like a big stone." She reached out, her tiny fingers hovering over his heart, not touching, just sensing. "Why is your heart so sad, Mr. Monster?" The nickname should have angered him. Instead, it shattered him. Mr. Monster. That was what he was. That was what her mother must have called him in the dark. Harrison looked at the child who had saved his life, the child whose father he had murdered, and felt a wave of grief so potent it nearly doubled him over. He wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to call for Rosalie. But he couldn't move. Because, Harrison whispered, the truth leaking out before he could stop it, "I have done terrible things. Things that cannot be fixed." Ruby looked at him, her expression unchanging, accepting the confession without judgment. "Mom says broken things can be fixed," she said simply. "You just have to use the right glue." She patted his knee, a gesture of comfort so innocent it felt like a burn, then turned and walked out of the library, leaving Harrison alone with the fire and the crushing weight of a soul that was finally waking up. Harrison sat at the marble chessboard, a battlefield he understood perfectly, but his opponents were 3 feet tall and wore pajamas. Zoe stared at the pieces with the intensity of a grandmaster, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "The knight jumps," Harrison explained, his voice losing the razor edge that usually terrified grown men. "It moves in an L shape. It doesn't go straight like the others." Zoe nodded slowly, picked up the black knight, and slammed it down with surprising force. "Checkmate," she whispered, a small smile touching her lips. Harrison blinked, stunned, scanning the board for an escape that didn't exist. He had been beaten by a 6-year-old. He threw his head back and laughed. It was a rusty, foreign sound that echoed through the silent mansion like a gunshot. In the doorway, the head housekeeper dropped a feather duster. Jasper stared from the corner, his hand twitching near his gun, terrified by the sound of his boss's joy. The ice was cracking, and everyone could hear it. The laughter died instantly when the heavy oak doors groaned open. Sterling Blackwood walked in, leaning heavily on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. He was 70, a retired king who still cast a long shadow over the Chicago underworld. He looked at the children, then at his son, his face a mask of stone. Harrison stood up, his body instinctively shifting to shield the girls, his face hardening back into the mask of the dawn. "Father," he nodded, the words stiff and formal. Sterling didn't smile. He walked to the window, looking out at the gray sky, ignoring the children completely. "You are playing games, Harrison," the old man rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "While wolves circle your gate, you are playing with dolls." Harrison stepped forward, his blue eyes flashing. "I am protecting my assets. These children saved the family empire." Sterling turned, his eyes sharp as flint, tapping Harrison's chest with the tip of his cane. "Is that what they are? Assets? Or are they the reason you finally look like a human being for the first time since your mother died?" Rosalie watched from the shadows of the hallway, her heart a tangled knot of fear and confusion. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him to keep Daniel's memory alive. But she saw the way he moved the chess pieces so the girls could win. She saw the way he positioned his body to shield them from his own father, a subtle shift of weight that shouted protection. The master who had ordered her husband's death was fading, replaced by a man trying to learn a language he hadn't spoken in 20 years. She walked into the room, placing a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder. Harrison looked up, and for a second, his guard dropped completely. There was no wall. There was only a man looking at a woman and wondering if he could ever be forgiven. It was a dangerous thought. In their world, hope was more dangerous than a bullet. Sterling watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing. "Softness gets you killed in this life, boy," he warned, walking toward the door. "But living without a heart isn't living either. Just make sure you survive the thaw." But hope doesn't stop snipers. 10 miles away, in a black van parked deep in the tree line bordering the estate, a man adjusted the focus on a long-range lens. The shutter clicked silently, capturing the image of Harrison standing near the window with the twins. The photo was uploaded instantly to a secure server in a penthouse across the city. Blake Morrison stared at the screen, swirling his scotch, his face illuminated by the digital glow. He didn't want a war. War was expensive and messy. He wanted the product. The neurological scans confirmed it, his lieutenant said, pointing to the data stream. The brain tissue regenerated. Those kids are the holy grail. Blake smiled, a shark-smelling chum in the water. "We don't kill the girls," he ordered, his voice smooth and cold. "And we don't kill the mother. We take them. If Harrison gets in the way, burn him down. Prepare the strike team. We move tonight." The digital clock on Harrison's nightstand read 2:14 a.m. when the silence of the estate was murdered. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with a click. Down in the security command center, Shift Commander Vance, a man Harrison had paid 6 figures a year for loyalty, typed a disable code into the mainframe. The perimeter sensors went blind. The silent alarms were muted. The magnetic locks on the service entrances disengaged with a soft mechanical sigh. Vance sent a single text message, clear. Then he put a bullet in his own head, knowing that Harrison's wrath would be worse than death. 2 minutes later, 12 shadows moved across the manicured lawn. They weren't street thugs, they were Tier 1 mercenaries paid in diamonds, moving with the fluid lethality of apex predators. They breached the south entrance, tossing canisters of knockout gas into the ventilation system. The gas hissed, invisible and odorless, meant to put the guards to sleep before they could draw their weapons. But Harrison Blackwood didn't sleep like a normal man. He slept like a soldier in a trench. He woke up instantly, his instincts screaming that the air pressure in the room had changed. He rolled out of bed, grabbing the suppressed pistol taped under the nightstand, and pressed the panic button. Nothing happened. The red light on the panel was dead. "Vance," Harrison hissed, realizing the betrayal in a heartbeat. He didn't waste time trying to call for help. He sprinted into the hallway, barefoot and wearing only sleep pants, moving toward the east wing. He heard the muffled thwip-thwip of silenced gunfire coming from the lower levels. His men were dying. He didn't care. He only cared about the 3 people sleeping in the penthouse. He reached the main staircase just as a black-clad figure crusted the landing. The mercenary raised his rifle. Harrison didn't hesitate. He fired twice, a double tap to the chest and head. The intruder dropped without a sound. Harrison didn't stop moving. He vaulted over the body, his mind cold, calculating, and absolutely terrified. Jasper. Harrison roared into his wrist cones, praying the internal channel was still active. Static hissed, then Jasper's voice broke through, breathless and distorted by gunfire. South breach. They're inside. They're cutting through to the elevators. Boss, get to the safe room. They aren't here for me. Harrison shouted, kicking open the stairwell door to the east wing. They're here for the girls. Seal the elevators. Blow the fuses if you have to. He took the stairs 3 at a time, his lungs burning. He heard glass shattering above him. They were rappelling from the roof. Blake Morrison hadn't just sent a ground team, he had sent a vertical assault squad. They were hitting the penthouse directly. Harrison's heart slammed against his ribs. Rosalie and the twins were trapped between a hammer and an anvil. He burst onto the penthouse landing just as the skylight exploded inward. Ropes dropped, and 3 men in tactical gear slid down, crashing onto the marble floor of the foyer. They raised their weapons, scanning for targets. Harrison was behind a marble pillar. He stepped out, firing with a precision born of 20 years of violence. 1 man went down, clutching his throat. The second spun, firing a burst that chipped the stone inches from Harrison's face. Harrison didn't flinch. He returned fire, dropping the second man. The third man charged, tackling Harrison before he could aim. They hit the floor hard, the gun skittering away. The mercenary was huge, a wall of muscle and Kevlar. He punched Harrison in the face, a blow that would have knocked out a lesser man. Harrison tasted blood. He laughed, a savage, feral sound, and drove his thumb into the man's eye socket. The mercenary screamed. Harrison grabbed a marble bust from a pedestal and brought it down on the man's skull. The screaming stopped. Harrison stood up, wiping blood from his mouth, his chest heaving. He picked up his gun and ran toward the bedroom door. "Rosalie," he screamed, hammering on the wood. "Open the door." "It's me." Rosalie shoved the heavy mahogany dresser against the double doors, her muscles screaming in protest. It was a futile barricade against trained killers, but it was the only thing standing between her children and the men who wanted to turn them into lab rats. Zoe and Ruby huddled in the corner behind the bed, clutching each other, their tears silent. They didn't scream. They have learned in the basement that screaming only brought punishment. The doorknob twisted violently. Then came the kick. The wood frame splintered with a deafening crack. Another kick, and the dresser slid a foot across the carpet, scraping deep grooves into the floor. Rosalie grabbed a heavy brass lamp, the cord trailing like a tail, and stood in front of her daughters. She wasn't a fighter. She was a maid. But tonight she was a mother, and she would beat the first man through that door until her arms broke. The door exploded inward. 2 men in tactical black gear stepped over the wreckage, their faces covered by masks, their eyes cold and dead behind ballistic goggles. "Target acquired," the lead mercenary said, his voice distorted by a radio. He didn't even look at Rosalie. He raised a taser, fired, and the prawns hit her in the stomach. Rosalie convulsed and collapsed, the lamp clattering from her numb fingers. She tried to scream, to crawl, but her body wouldn't obey. The second mercenary moved toward the corner, reaching for Zoe with a gloved hand. "Come here, little asshat," he sneered. "Time to go." Zoe shrank back, her eyes wide with terror. But before the man could touch her, a shadow detached itself from the hallway darkness. Harrison Blackwood slammed into the room like a runaway freight train. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his shirt torn, his gun empty and discarded. He didn't need a weapon. He hit the second mercenary with the force of a battering ram, driving his shoulder into the man's kidneys. The mercenary grunted and folded. Harrison grabbed the man's helmet, twisted hard, and threw him into the wall with a sickening crunch. The lead mercenary, the one who had tasered Rosalie, spun around. He raised his suppressed rifle. But Harrison wasn't looking at the gun. He was looking past the gunman, straight at Zoe. The mercenary wasn't aiming at Harrison. He was aiming at the child's leg, intending to cripple her so she couldn't run. Harrison saw the finger tighten on the trigger. He knew the math. He knew he couldn't reach the shooter in time. He could only reach the bullet. Harrison threw himself across the room, his body becoming a human shield between the weapon and the child. The gun coughed once, a sound like a whip crack. Harrison jerked midair as if yanked by an invisible wire. He crashed to the floor at Zoe's feet, a dark stain instantly blooming on the left side of his chest. The mercenary cursed and racked the slide to fire again, but the hallway suddenly erupted with noise. Jasper and the B-team poured through the door, their weapons blazing. The remaining mercenary went down in a hail of bullets before he could take a second breath. Silence rushed back into the room, heavy and smelling of copper. Jasper dropped his weapon and fell to his knees beside his boss. "Harrison," he shouted, pressing his hands onto the wound, trying to stem the flow of bright red arterial blood. "Stay with me. Medic. Get the medic up here now." Harrison lay on his back, his breath coming in wet, shallow gasps. The pain was blinding, a white-hot poker driven through his ribs, but he didn't look at the wound. He looked at Zoe. She was unhurt. She was staring at him, her green eyes filled with a horror that no 6-year-old should ever know. Rosalie, shaking off the effects of the taser, crawled across the floor, sobbing. You jumped," she whispered, staring at the man who had killed her husband. "You took the bullet." Zoe and Ruby scrambled forward, their small hands already reaching out, glowing with that faint, golden light. They wanted to fix him. They wanted to push the bad red hole away. "No," Harrison wheezed, grabbing their wrists with a strength fueled by pure will. His blood smeared onto their small, clean skin. "Don't. We can save you," Ruby cried, tears dripping onto his face. "We can fix it like the black thing." "No," Harrison rasped, coughing up a speck of blood. He remembered how pale they had been after the gala. He remembered how they had almost collapsed. A brain tumor was one thing, but a bullet wound? Repairing shredded lung and artery? It would drain them dry. It might kill them. "It's too much," Harrison whispered, looking at Rosalie. "Don't let them. It will kill them." He chose to bleed. He chose to die rather than treat them like batteries again. His eyes started to drift shut, the darkness closing in, not terrifying this time, but welcoming. He had balanced the ledger. A life for a life. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in the darkened room, a rhythmic reminder that Harrison Blackwood was still tethered to the world of the living. He woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the crushing weight of bandages wrapped tight around his chest. Pain radiated from his ribs with every shallow breath, a brutal, jagged agony that proved he was mortal, but the warmth holding his hand grounded him. He opened his eyes to see Rosalie sitting by the bed, her head resting on the mattress, her fingers intertwined with his. She looked exhausted, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, her maid's uniform stained with his blood. She hadn't run. She hadn't taken the chaos as a chance to escape. She had stayed. Harrison squeezed her hand weakly, and her head snapped up, her eyes wide with relief and lingering terror. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice trembling as she reached for the plastic water cup. "The doctor said the bullet missed your heart by an inch. You lost a lot of blood. The girls..." Harrison rasped, the words scraping his dry throat like sandpaper. "Safe," Rosalie promised, brushing the hair off his forehead with a tenderness that shocked them both. "They're with Jasper. They wanted to heal you, Harrison. They cried when the doctors took you away." Harrison closed his eyes, relief washing over him. He had taken the bullet and they were safe. That was all that mattered. But safety was a temporary illusion in his world, and Harrison knew the predator was still waiting in the dark. He didn't rest. He demanded to be moved. Ignoring Rosalie's frantic protests and the doctor's threats of internal bleeding, Harrison forced himself out of bed 2 hours later. He refused the wheelchair, leaning heavily on a cane Jasper provided, and threw a fresh black suit jacket over his bandaged chest to hide the weakness. He wasn't going to his office. He was going to the basement. Not the laundry room where the twins used to hide, but the soundproof holding cell beneath the garage. Jasper waited at the heavy steel door, his face grim and pale. "He's inside, boss," Jasper said, handing Harrison a heavy encrypted tablet. "He's laughing. He thinks his crew will come for him. He thinks this is just another Tuesday." Harrison didn't speak. He swiped his thumb across the biometric lock, the bolts retracting with a heavy clink, and stepped into the cold concrete room. Blake Morrison sat zip-tied to a steel chair, his face bruised but his arrogance untouched. He looked up as Harrison entered, a bloody sneer curling his lip. "You look like hell, Harrison," Blake laughed, spitting a tooth onto the floor. "Did my boys teach you a lesson? You can't keep them. They belong to the business. You're dead, you just don't know it yet." Harrison leaned against the concrete wall, the pain in his chest sharp and clarifying, clearing the fog from his mind. He looked at Blake not with anger, but with the detached pity of a man watching a bug crawl toward an open flame. "You don't get it, Blake," Harrison said softly, his voice echoing in the small, damp room. "You think this is a turf war. You think I'm going to torture you, maybe kill you, and then we go back to fighting over territory." Blake's smile faltered slightly, his eyes darting to the tablet in Harrison's hand. "That's how it works. Kill me and my brother takes over. You can't stop the wheel." "I'm not trying to stop the wheel," Harrison said, tossing the tablet onto Blake's lap. "I'm breaking it." Blake looked down. The screen displayed a live upload progress bar. It wasn't a bank transfer. It was a data dump sent directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division. "What is this?" Blake whispered, his face draining of color. "That," Harrison said, "is the ledger for the entire East Coast Commission. Every bribe, every body, every trafficking route. Yours, mine, everyone's." Blake screamed, struggling against the zip ties until his wrists bled. "You're insane. You're incriminated in that data. You're burning yourself down. You'll go to prison for life." "I know," Harrison replied calmly, turning toward the door. "I'm trading my empire for their safety. The feds will be here in 10 minutes to pick you up. They have the location of your safe houses, your accounts, and your partners." He walked out, leaving Blake screaming impotent threats at the closing steel door. Harrison Blackwood, the heart of stone, had just committed the ultimate betrayal of the underworld code. He had become a rat. He had destroyed 20 years of power in a single click. But as he climbed the stairs, pain flaring in his chest with every step, he didn't feel shame. He felt light. He had burned the kingdom to save the princess, and for the first time in 20 years, the silence in his head wasn't darkness. It was peace. The dismantling of the Blackwood Empire wasn't loud like a bomb. It was quiet like a funeral. For 3 days, black SUVs rolled out of the estate gates, carrying away lieutenants who refused to follow a boss that had turned rat. Harrison stood on the balcony, watching them leave, his chest aching beneath the bandages, but he didn't stop them. He had liquidated the offshore accounts, transferred the clean money to a trust for the twins, and handed the dirty money to the feds as evidence. Vince, his longest-serving captain, spat on the driveway before getting into his car. "You were a king," Vince had sneered, his eyes full of betrayal. "Now you're nothing but a target." Harrison didn't argue because Vince was right. He had traded his crown for a clear conscience, and the weight of the crown had been heavier than he realized. The mansion was silent now, stripped of the armed guards and the constant hum of illicit business. It felt empty, but for the first time, it didn't feel haunted. Harrison found Rosalie in the Rose Garden, the place where she used to steal moments of peace when she was a slave. She was cutting dead blooms, her movements sharp and angry, the shears snapping with a violent rhythm. She didn't look up when he approached, though he knew she heard the tap of his cane on the stone path. "They're all gone," Harrison said, his voice rough from the smoke of burning bridges. "The guards, the crews, the money. It's just us and the ghosts." Rosalie stopped cutting, the shears freezing midair. She turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for the monster she had hated for 8 months. But the monster wasn't there. In his place stood a man with gray skin and a bullet hole in his chest, a man who had burned down his own world to save her children. "You gave it all up," she whispered, as if saying it aloud made it real. "Blake, the commission, your reputation." "Why?" "Because I owed a debt," Harrison answered, stepping closer, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "And because I realized that being a king of ashes isn't worth one hair on their heads." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys and a passport. "This is for the house in Tuscany," he said, holding them out with a trembling hand. "It's in your name. It's safe. No one knows about it. Take the girls. Go." Rosalie looked at the keys, then up at his face. She saw the desperation in his blue eyes, the absolute willingness to lose her if it meant she was happy. It would be so easy to take them, to run, to forget the blood on the floor and the man who spilled it. But then she remembered the way he had thrown himself in front of the bullet. She remembered the way he looked at Zoe and Ruby, not as assets, but as miracles. She remembered that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but about believing in the future. Rosalie didn't take the keys. She took his hand. The contact was electric, shocking them both into silence. "I can't forget what you did," she said, her voice shaking. "I see Daniel every time I look at this garden, but I also see the man who died to save his children." Harrison stopped breathing. He looked at their joined hands, the scarred knuckles of a killer interlaced with the rough fingers of a maid. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he rasped, his throat tight. "I don't deserve it." "No, you don't," Rosalie agreed, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "But you're trying to earn it. And I think I want to stay and watch you try." The air between them shifted, charged with the heavy, unspoken thing that had been growing since the night of the gala. Harrison leaned in, hesitant for the first time in his life, giving her every chance to back away. She didn't. She tilted her head up, closing the distance. The kiss wasn't demanding or hungry. It was a seal on a treaty, a quiet promise made in the wreckage of a war. It tasted of grief and hope, of salt and rain. And when they pulled apart, Harrison Blackwood knew that he had lost an empire, but he had finally found a home. It had been exactly 365 days since the guns went silent. The ribbon cutting for the Turner Blackwood Pediatric Center wasn't attended by mob bosses or corrupt senators, but by mothers from the South Side who couldn't afford insurance. Harrison stood at the back of the crowd, wearing a gray suit instead of black, his hand resting on the scar tissue over his heart. He watched Rosalie cut the red ribbon, her smile brighter than the flashbulbs of the local press. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was a partner, a director, the face of a miracle that had grown from the ashes of a crime syndicate. Harrison didn't miss the power. He didn't miss the fear in people's eyes. He looked at the clinic, a building funded by the liquidation of his sins, and felt a quiet satisfaction that was worth more than all the dirty money in Chicago. Zoe and Ruby ran through the lobby, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, looking like ordinary first graders. No one knew they could knit bone back together with a touch. That was the family rule. The gift was for emergencies only, a secret kept within the four walls of their home. They didn't need to be healers for the world. They just needed to be children. Harrison watched them high-five the security guard, Jasper, who had traded his silencer for a walkie-talkie, and felt a lump in his throat. They called him Dad now. It had happened 3 months ago over a bowl of cereal, casual and earth-shattering. He wasn't their biological father, and he never would be, but he was the man who checked under the bed for monsters, ironic because he used to be the biggest monster of them all. Dinner that night was a chaotic symphony of clinking forks and spilled milk. Rosalie laughed as Ruby tried to explain the plot of a cartoon, her hands flying in the air, knocking over the salt shaker. Harrison reached out, catching it before it hit the table, his reflexes still sharp, but used now for preservation rather than violence. He looked around the table at the family he had built on the edge of a grave. The headaches were gone. The darkness was gone. In its place was a messy, loud, imperfect love that terrified him more than any gun ever had. He caught Rosalie's eye across the table. She didn't look away. She smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips that told him he was forgiven, that he was home. Harrison Blackwood took a bite of his food, realizing that the heart of stone hadn't just cracked, it had been transplanted entirely. This story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption if they are willing to burn their bridges to build a raft. Harrison proved that power isn't about controlling others, it's about protecting the people you love. Rosalie showed us that sometimes the strongest weapon against a monster is unconditional compassion. Thank you for listening to this story on Sunni romance. We hope it touched your heart and reminded you that even in the darkest winter, spring is just one act of kindness away. How did this ending make you feel? Do you think Harrison deserved a second chance after everything he did? Let us know in the comments below because we love reading your thoughts. Until next time, keep believing in miracles.